Hello everyone, this is Jordan Temkin, Team Big Whoop Pilot signing in. Today we're going to show you how to build a sandwich. That's the combination of a Afro naze or a maze revision 3 and a X4R into the smallest, lightest, most compact way possible. It uses a X4R right here, which we prefer over a D4R due to there being less latency in S-Bus than PPM, though you can still do the exact same thing with the D4R. So first of all, let's check out the weights. So our sandwich here with FTDI extension weighs in at almost exactly 6 grams, while a more traditional setup such as the Afro naze and the pinned X4R come in at almost twice as much weight. So when we're racing, every gram counts. So we really like this setup right here. It also makes it much easier to build something like an XBR where we have limited space to put all our electronics. The sandwich fits in there a lot easier than something like a full naze board, though you can still build an XBR with a full naze board. Alright everyone, so first of all let's just look at these boards real quick and give it a rundown. These 6 innermost pins are going to be your motor output pins. We got 1 through 6. The next middle rail is going to be your 5-volt rail, and then lastly your most outer rail is going to be your ground. If we look at the X4R here, we have ground is the square in the middle, then the next outer pins from the square are going to be your 5-volt, and then your outermost pins are going to be your signal. This pin right here is your S-Bus pin, which is going to be what we wire directly up to. Let's look back at the Afro maze. Get it in focus there. The RX port, the USART2 RX port, which is this second pin right here marked RX. So, to combine these two, we're merely just going to go like that, but without the pins, and solder up the middle box right here. Let's get it back into focus there. So we're going to solder up the middle box, as we remember being the grounds, to these 2 ground pins, and then the power pins are going to be right here and right here. So we're going to make a little trapezoid of pins. We use 2 each for structural reasons. We don't want our flight controller breaking or anything while we're crashing. We all know we do that a bunch. So let's start depinning this X4R. I like to cut away the pins that we're not going to be using and then start depinning just the important ones. You are totally welcome to just go all out and depin everything like this board here, though personally I think that's an absolute pain and kind of unnecessary. So let's get to work. First of all, we cut this outer signal that we don't really care about. We want to keep this power because that's going to be going to our Afro Mini. We do not need this ground right here, and we do not need this ground right here. Then we want to skip this because we're going to use that power again, and then we're going to get right in here and cut that signal. So next we're going to start pulling away this black plastic here. We can pop it off just like that. We once again do not need this signal right here, so we're just gonna chop that off chop the plastic as the best of our abilities, just like that. And we do not need this ground right here, so we're actually going to cut the black, and then we're going to see if we can do our best to slide that black plastic off right there and cut that pin just like that. You might want eye protection, as these pins do go flying everywhere. So we cut this one right here. We're gonna just get rid of this plastic, but once again try and keep this pin as intact as possible. If you break it off, no big deal. You can always just solder a new pin back on. Next we're going to, let's see, get rid of just these plastic pieces. We do not need, let's see, we do not need this plastic right here like that. We do not need this one either, so we're gonna chop it. We're gonna try and keep that one right there intact as much as possible. Once again, it's best to take your time here, going a little quick for the sake of video. So once again, we do not need this signal right here that we already cut, so we're just gonna get rid of the plastic. There we go. And last but not least, we're gonna cut the S-bus pin right there, and see if you can slide off this black plastic right here. We're actually not gonna need this pin either, and we're gonna cut that right there. So as you can see now, we have two grounds right here and two power right there. Those 4 pins are what we're gonna need to solder it on to the Afro Mini. So let's get to depinning. First of all, I'd recommend putting your X4R in some sort of vise to hold it for you, and having a solder sucker can be very, very useful. What we'd like to do is grab your soldering iron and get it nice and wet with some solder here. Use your solder sucker, and once you heat this pin up, you just suck the solder out of it. Grab some pliers of some sort and just tap this pin right here while wiggling. Give it a nice wiggle. And there is your first pin out. So we're going to repeat the process for the rest of these pins here. Can be a little difficult with the camera in front of you, so I'll do my best. We're going to just get this pin a little hot here and give it a little wiggle. And there we go. Alright, so now if you're having some trouble, definitely use that solder sucker to get rid of some of that solder. It will help out immensely. Otherwise, you can just kind of do what I'm doing here and just yank at them. And then, lastly, let's get this last pin here. Just heat it up, give it a nice little wiggle, maybe push a bit with your soldering iron. And almost there. So looks like we got a troublesome one there. Let's use the solder sucker. So we like to heat this up until we see that the solder starts flowing. Give it a nice suck. And go in for the D-pin. Alright, so now that we got all those pins out, we want to clear these holes up here so that we can put new pins through them. This is where the solder sucker comes in handy. You can also use a solder wick. Just get your soldering iron a little wet here, tap it to the back, let it start flowing, and we just suck out the solder. Do it to all the other holes here, and just keep doing that until you have a nice solder free hole. Looks like I'm getting a little out of view there, sorry about that. Alright, so one last little bit of solder. Alright, so now we have a depinned X4R. Alright, so next up we're going to make the pins that we're going to use as a spacer in between our sandwich. I don't have any 2-pin wide right now, so I'm just going to make one from a 3-pin. We're going to break off this extra row we have here, and then we remove 2 middle ones here, and 2 outer ones here. Like that, to make that same trapezoid pattern that we desoldered. So let's get soldering. We're gonna first tin up the wire we're gonna use for S-bus and just tap it right onto that furthest top pin right there. We're gonna angle it back because remember, the RX port on the naze is all the way back here. And then next, we're gonna take our trapezoidal pin that we made and solder it right onto the board. Gonna have to flip this around real quick. Alright, so take our solder and just solder this up. Yep, solder bridge there, and we're all good. So now, if we look at this, this is all soldered on there, and we can press this spacer all the way down as far as we can go, and that is a ready receiver. We're now going to attach the naze board onto the X4R here. And as you can see, these pins line up just perfectly with the 2 power pins coming out of that middle rail and the 2 ground pins coming out of the furthest ground rail, and we can just solder this guy right up like this. I'm actually going to just set it on top. I'm gonna grab some solder, and here we go. Alright, so we're just going to trim off these extra pins that we now have sticking at the top. Just like that. And that is a almost finished sandwich right there. So last but not least, we're gonna solder up the S-bus wire. So we're gonna tin up that RX port, tin up the wire there, get our iron nice and wet, grab some sort of pliers, or just use your fingers, and just tap that wire right there. Let's try that again. I'm gonna solder that right there. Just like that. Then to finish off the sandwich, we're gonna squirt some hot glue right into the back of here to make sure nothing ever shorts between the antennas, as well as give it a little more structure so our flight controller is not wobbling around back here. So we're just gonna take our hot glue gun, and actually before we do that, if you want to position your antennas, you can actually swivel these out beforehand. But we're just going to leave them coming out the back like that, and just give it a nice squirt, just like that. And that is a finished sandwich. The last step of the sandwich is attaching a FTDI extension to the board so that when we have our XBR here, we will have a little FTDI plug hot glued right about there, or really anywhere, so that we can plug into the flight controller without having to remove the hood. What we're gonna do is just tin up these pads right here, which on the revision 3, I believe the pins are 3V RX TX ground, or if you're using a 5V FTDI, we have 5V ground TX RX. In our case, we are using a 3V FTDI. So I'm going to very quickly or slowly here, depending on if this will cooperate. Oh man, here we go. So I'm just going to tin up these wires. And remember, on an FTDI, we have the RX on the flight controller talks to the TX on your FTDI. So we're going to go power here. Then we're going to go RX, which On this end is TX. We're going to solder this up just like this. And now we have extended the FTDI. And let's fire it up and see if it works. Alright, so we're going to test out, make sure this flight controller works. Plug it in here. Go over to Clean Flight. We really like Boris B's Betaflight firmware, so we're going to flash that right onto here. It's going to take a moment. Looks like. Yep.
We'll edit. We'll edit that.
It's taken a bit.
Pull like King in the Hill.
Yep. Or we could fast forward that part where it's like we're just talking over it.
That's funny.
I want to like start talking right before it finishes, but alright, so now that the firmware is just about finished here, we're gonna connect back up, make sure everything is in working order, and it looks like we are good to go. Next up, we're just gonna check and bind up the receiver, make sure that works. So we're gonna solder up some wires right here in order to test our receiver. If you have a 5-volt power supply, just plug right into that, or you can also use these wires later on for your Pololu or some sort of 5-volt regulator if you're using opto ESCs, which we recommend to save weight. Definitely don't need as thick of gauge wires as I just used. That's just what we had laying around. And just gonna solder up a pin to it so we can check. I always recommend soldering directly to all your regulators and everything in the in order to save weight as well as space.
And a more reliable connection.
And a more reliable connection. Thank you, Chris Fisher, the designer and mind behind the XBR. Alright, so now that we got that all hooked up, we're going to jump on over to our power supply and grab a transmitter and bind up. So we're going to bind up, go into bind mode on your Tyrannies here. Then we're going to plug into our 5-volt power supply. If you've already built this up on your quad or something, you'd be using a 5-volt regulator such as the Pololu 5-volt step down. We really like the 600 milliamp version for its lightweightness. I'm gonna hold down the button here and plug it right in. The green and red light should turn on. We're gonna take that off, get out of bind mode, and we're gonna plug that right back in. And we got a green light, meaning we bound up just fine. And we're gonna check on the computer, make sure everything is working. So, plug in the FTDI there, click connect. We're just gonna calibrate for the heck of it. Oops. And then we'll jump over to, we go to ports first, go to UART2, press serial RX, save and reboot. Then we're going to go over to our configurations, scroll down right here, click enable RX serial, and then pick S bus and go back down to the bottom, save and reboot. We don't use VBAT, so we're actually going to take that off of there. Go over to our receiver, type in TAER because that's the default channel mapping of the trannies. Press save, and now we should have our throttle is the throttle, our yaw is the yaw. Make sure everything works properly, and it looks like we're all set up, working great. Happy flying!